Welcome back. In this particular segment, we're going to discuss a topic that quite literally can be inflammatory. When you talk about individuals and what they decide to do sexually, it's always a hot topic. It's always a situation where individuals do not want to be judged. There should be no standard in this regard. But in this particular episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the correlation between promiscuity and self injury. So, to get things started on the right foot, what does it mean to be promiscuous? I'll refer to my notes on this one because I want everything that we mentioned to be factual and I want it to be clear, even though we'll be making observations. Because I have to admit that in this particular area, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I'm simply making an observation as to how these two areas correlate. So let's begin the correlation, shall we? Promiscuous means having or involving many sexual partners, not restricted to one sexual partner or few sexual partners. So there's the definition to be promiscuous, to have many sexual partners. Now, what about the definition of self harm? Now, in this particular instance, we are comparing being promiscuous to being an individual who performs self mutilation. But so that things will be more palatable, more acceptable, we'll simply use the term self harm or self injury, okay? But that means to mutilate oneself, especially as a symptom of mental or emotional disturbance. Did you pick up on that? Mental or emotional disturbance. Let's keep going. It says, or the act of purposely hurting oneself as an emotional coping mechanism. So now we have the definition for promiscuous means to have many sexual partners. And then in the definition for self harm, you see that there are causes of individuals performing self harm, namely mental or emotional disturbance, or as an emotional coping mechanism. So you have a disturbance in your life, maybe a trauma, maybe something happens to you. And then as a result of the trauma that you experience, to cope with that particular trauma, you use self harm or self injury or self mutilation as a coping response, a coping mechanism. So now, how does being promiscuous tie into that? Well, let's get into a couple of videos that I've chosen, and I want you to listen to this first video. Now, this video, to set it up, is a discussion that's being had by Oprah Winfrey and a couple of other panel members. One of them is Iyanla Van Zant, and then the other one, who we want to pay particular attention to, is Dr. Perry. Now, they make a statement in this particular segment I think that's noteworthy, and is actually the basis for this particular video segment that we're doing right now. Let's get into it and see what they say.
Oh, that's promiscuity is the main thing. It is rarely seen as self-mutilation, but that's exactly what it is.
Absolutely, it's violence
we
against
often, when we look at young girls who are dealing with pain, we think of self-mutilation as the cutting and all that too. But the self-mutilation of allowing someone to physically enter you is in knowing that you don't care about yourself enough to say,
wow, that's a big one.
That at least you have to have
That's
something.
a big tweet, Dr. Perry.
Well, you know.
That self-mutilation comes in the form of
Promiscuity.
And that it's violence against yourself. I never.
So now, as I mentioned, this is the groundwork for the discussion that we're having. And that particular part of the segment where Dr. Perry was discussing his thoughts on why young ladies turn to being promiscuous is something that I think is noteworthy. Because now, one of the things that I've come to find out in experiences that I've had is that a lot of the times when individuals engage in behavior that you may have never seen from them, the behavior is based in trauma. The behavior is based in a traumatic experience that fell upon them, and now they're acting in a way that's not typical of the way that they would normally behave. And so, what we're saying is that the expression of an individual being promiscuous is just that. It's driven by trauma. Now, how does that trauma manifest itself in the future? Well, that also is a line of reasoning that I think we need to look at, because anything that you do in the present, you need to most definitely be assured that what you do will have some kind of result. Whether it's good or bad, there will be a result from what you choose to do, what you choose to subject yourself to, your mind and your body, whatever you choose to do, there will be an effect on both, right? We understand that. So now, in the particular video that we just saw, Dr. Perry talks about the promiscuity of young girls being the result of trauma, things that they might have experienced. In this particular case, the trauma was as a result of having an absent father. The father was not in their life, and so they're using promiscuity, they're using sex as a coping mechanism. Okay? So now, as I mentioned, how would using your body in this particular way, what would be the result of it? What would be something in the future that would happen that would call into account what you chose to do? And now we're not talking about just the women in our species, because the video talked about promiscuity in young girls, but let's make it clear, we're talking about promiscuous individuals in general. Regardless of whether you're male or female, we're addressing you, because there is a notion that needs to be cleared up. We're going to do it today, okay? So now, the effects of promiscuity in the future. I want you to take a look at this next clip. It's from a YouTube creator, and her page is called In Bed with Bella. And she chose to go through this, what we'll call free phase, to be respectful. She went through this free phase, and now she wants to explain some of the reasons why she felt the need to do it. So let's take a look and see what she has to say.
The second reason is a lot more real and maybe a lot more relatable to other people, but I was mad depressed. 27 was a pretty difficult year for me. I was severely depressed. My relationship ending the month after my birthday was, actually took a lot more of a toll on me than I think I wanted to admit. I wanted to come off as very strong and just move on and keep it pushing. And months later, I realized I'm not happy. So, typical coping mechanism for people trying to avoid their depression is, spending time with other people, distracting themselves with other people, and that's kind of what I was doing. And honestly, it wasn't the host made me realize that I was depressed. It was when that depression started to spill into other aspects of my life, like keeping my room clean, going to the gym. I started getting kind of chunky. My plants were dying, and you guys know I love my plant babies. Not filming the episode, I didn't feel inspired. It really wasn't until all those things started to happen that I was able to, one, focus on those things, and once I got that kind of situated, step back and be like, okay, what's actually the root of the problem here? What's going on? Even though I really, really liked it.
So, what did you gain from that particular video? Did you see a common thread? Now, according to Bella, the results of this particular free phase that she went through was because of depression. And she was depressed because of the fact that she had undergone a breakup. And so that breakup caused her to fall into depression, and depression manifested itself in her free phase. Those are not my words. Those are not terms that I use. She used those terms. She even mentioned that it was a coping mechanism for her. So if it's a coping mechanism for her, and it's caused by trauma, and it has to do with an external stimulus in order to cope, wouldn't that be self-harm? Because make no mistake about it, listen now, we can look at this situation from whatever lens we want to, but the act of having sex with multiple partners without any concern for yourself, your mental health, your emotional health, your own well-being, is self-injury. It is. It's self-mutilation. Because at any time during the process, we know from the video, and we'll put the video in the description, that Bella was mindful in who it was that she decided to enter into these kind of relationships with. But if there is an individual and they are promiscuous and they're doing it without any regard for themselves, especially for their own health, then that's driven by trauma. And that's self-injury. That's self-injury. And it's especially self-injury because the effects, the wounds, are not exterior. The cuts and the gashes are interior. They have to do with the way a person views themselves after they have went through this particular free phase. The way that they interact with other individuals. You have to understand that it changes your perception. It changes who you are. It changes how you feel about individuals who you're in a relationship with in the future. So no, the effects of it are not exterior; they're interior. And because they're interior, it's a possibility that they could be worse than what you imagine. So now, with those two videos in mind, we have the one where Dr. Perry makes it clear that being promiscuous is actually self-mutilation, self-harm, self-injury. And then we have the video that came after it where Bella talks about how it is that being promiscuous or going through that free phase was caused by depression. And that depression was caused by a breakup with her boyfriend. So the two terms are lining up. Uh, an individual is promiscuous as a result of depression or as a result of something that happens dramatic to them that they have to account for. They have to adapt to it. And then after that adaptation takes place, individuals find that they cope with these difficulties that they're having with being promiscuous. It's a cycle. It's a cycle. Because being promiscuous, having intercourse with many and different partners, that intercourse, that experience, the climax that's involved will make you feel good. But it's only momentary. And so you have to find other partners. And then, like we mentioned, it turns into a cycle. Now you're stuck in the cycle of being promiscuous to deal with the trauma that you're having to go through, and yet you haven't found a solution for the problems that you're undergoing because being promiscuous is not the solution. It's not. So now, as we mentioned, Bella talked about the difficulties associated with using sex as a coping mechanism, but then I want to consider an article with you. I want to draw your attention to an article that talks about some of the future difficulties associated with being a promiscuous person. Okay? Let's get into that article. So now the title of the article is Can Renouncing Promiscuity Help You Find Monogamous Love? Now, we wanted to be clear from the beginning that the monogamous love that's being mentioned in this particular article is a long-term committed relationship in the future. So now, as we mentioned, that's what we're focusing on for the last part of this segment are the effects of being promiscuous in the past. Can they have an impact on the future? Now let's see. So now in this particular article, it talks about a study, and this study was done to see whether or not a person's past actions can affect their future eligibility or desirability for a long-term partner. Okay? And let me get us caught up. We're actually in this first paragraph here that's on the page, and let's go from there. Now, this study was conducted by a psychologist, Daniel Jones, in the University of Texas at El Paso. And so what they did, they recruited 180 adults. 53% were women, 58 were white, 70% were in a serious relationship or marriage, and the mean age of each individual was 32. So across that spectrum, most of the individuals that they chose were 32. Okay? And so what they did was they presented these individuals with potentially three romantic targets. Okay? Three romantic targets. And then they want the individual to assume that the gender and the race that these individuals who they were going to present to them were in among the pool that they would be interested in dating. Okay? Let's keep going. So now here are the three. I'll put the first two up, okay? The first one is the non-promiscuous target. And that particular person had sex with two people, and this is how they describe themselves. I'm looking for someone I can have a serious relationship with. I have never been interested in just having sex with someone. I need feelings and commitment behind it. So now this is the first individual that's presented. The very first one, okay? Now the second, the reformed promiscuous target, right? This person has had sex with approximately 40 people, but they are no longer doing that. That's not their custom anymore. Now listen how they describe themselves in the reading. It says, I used to have a lot of casual relationships and sex in the past, but that is behind me now. I haven't had sex with anyone for over a year and only to committed serious relationships now. I am looking for someone who wants the same thing. So that's the second person. Now here's the third person. Let me get it on screen. The still promiscuous target. It mentions that this person has had approximately 50 sexual partners. And this is the way that they describe themselves. I enjoy all kinds of relationships. I am really open. I am willing to have some casual relationships, and I am open to a more long-term relationship. I enjoy meeting and dating all kinds of people and having all kinds of relationships. So now, the individuals that were involved in the study, the 180 adults that were involved in the study, how did they rate these individuals? Well, let's go down to the chart. And the title of the chart, which person would you rather have a long-term relationship with? The solid black is men, and then the striped is women rating male targets, okay? So now let's take a look at it. Very few people, 6% actually, chose still promiscuous. 6% of the total people that were interviewed chose individuals who were still promiscuous. 94% chose individuals outside of those who are still promiscuous, right? Now, if you go on and look, you'll see that 80% of men and 60% of women, they chose the never promiscuous target as their ideal. So you see that two partners, the one who is never promiscuous, that's the one that's labeled as two partners. Do you see that 80% of men and 62% of women prefer these kinds of individuals for long-term relationships or marriage? So now that would suggest that most people want a monogamous relationship with an individual who has limited sexual history and they have no interest in casual sex, past or present. So now that puts things in perspective for us. Not only are we saying that being promiscuous is actually self-injury, but we're also saying that that self-injury in the future, depending on how great it is, will limit whether or not an individual will be able to find a long-term monogamous relationship. Okay? Now let's go to the individuals who are reformed and promiscuous. Those represent the category that's 40 partners, but then it mentions non-reformed, 14 men and 32 women. So 14% of men would look at these individuals as suitable candidates for a long-term partnership, marriage. 32% of women would look at these individuals as suitable partners. And maybe the difference here is because a lot of the women that are described here in the 32%, they see value in the fact that men may have some sexual skill or they might have an adventurous spirit, and that might be something that's appealing to some women. So he's experienced, he's good at love making, or he's adventurous. But now look at what the description was. The description though is that the person has been celibate for a year. So they're not practicing promiscuity anymore, but in these women's minds, it's a good thing because he had sexual experience. Right? Okay, let's keep going. There's another point I wanted to bring out. Uh, and mostly from this particular chart, you can see that the overwhelming majority, and that's the point I want to bring out, the overwhelming majority favored individuals who had less sexual partners, who were not promiscuous and had no intent on becoming promiscuous in the future. Uh, these individuals, 80% of men would prefer those as long, prefer women or who had less than two partners as far as marriage is concerned. 62% of women would prefer an individual with less than two partners as far as marriage is concerned. The numbers are absolutely clear. So, when we look back at the chart and at the information that we've gained from this particular study, the reaction of the individuals who are involved was clear. Long-term monogamous relationships usually require individuals who have no concern whatsoever for entering into casual sex relationships. These individuals are looking for monogamous long-term relationships. And so they've kept the amount of sexual partners that they've dealt with to a minimum. So now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, these are only observations. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I think that the two correlate. And anything that you do out of trauma is going to cause you difficulties in the future. You should never allow trauma to dictate what you do because those decisions are going to be seen through a lens of hurt and pain. And that's not what you want to set as a criteria for the decisions that you make in your life. So now, once again, what are the conclusions that I can come to? My conclusions might be different from yours, but the conclusion that I come to is that promiscuity, having multiple sexual partners, is a form of self-harm, self-injury, self-mutilation. It is. Because when we go back and look at the definition of self-harm, self-mutilation, it mentions that this is an emotional coping mechanism. Some trauma has come upon an individual, and what they decide to do to cope with the difficulties of their trauma is to have multiple sexual partners. And unlike physical self-harm, there may not be any signs on the outside that can warn the person of what has happened to this person that they're getting into a relationship with. But those particular scars are scars that manifest themselves inwardly. The way that an individual feels about himself, his own self-worth. The way that that person deals with other individuals, like in the family. And then it manifests itself in the way that they approach relationships with other individuals. They're using sex as a way to deal and cope with difficulties in their life. And I think Bella was a good example. When we looked at the segment of the video that she talked about her free phase, she made a correlation for us between the breakup, then the depression, and then as a result of the depression, the free phase. So the logic is clear. It's clear. We as individuals, and I said this on the last live show that I did, we as individuals have to invest in finding positive and beneficial coping mechanisms for trauma. When we encounter difficult things, when we lose a loved one, when we have problems maintaining our own employment, we might lose our job. There are a number of things that could happen that could traumatize an individual. But as adults, we have to invest in finding positive strategies to deal with that trauma that will allow us to maintain our own mental health and stability. Being promiscuous is not one of them. A promiscuous person is using his body to try to cope with the difficulties that they face. More specifically, that person is using sex as a coping mechanism. Now, in its proper place, sex is a good thing. It helps us to procreate. It's enjoyable between the husband and the wife. Those things are fine. But when we take sex outside of the realm of something that's positive and we use it as a substitute for the hard work of finding a positive way to deal with our difficulties, now we've turned this situation into one where we're carrying on self-injury, self-mutilation, self-harm. I think it's a subject that needs to be explored. And I did my best to touch on, from a surface level, what this can possibly manifest itself as. We need to be aware, because a lot of times when you see videos when individuals are talking about their free phase, whether it's a man or a woman, they want to convince you that it was something that you need to do and that it's enjoyable. And they're ignoring the fact that later on in life, this will most definitely have an effect on you and anyone who you choose to partner with. I think it's important that we understand that the root of being promiscuous is trauma. Now, you might disagree. You might say that there are a number of reasons why. But the main reason why I'm focusing on being promiscuous is because that is what's being pushed in society. To go and find yourself, to be free, to have sexual liberation and all of these things without any thought of what the future may hold. I think that's dangerous. I think that kind of rhetoric is disastrous for individuals who in the future know that they want a husband or a wife and a family. It's disastrous to you, because along the way, you are certainly injuring yourself. Those are my thoughts on the video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Be easy.